The date was March 24th, 1986. The air inside the P-18 radar van was thick with the smell of stale tobacco, hot vacuum tubes, and the faint metallic tang of ozone. It was the scent of the Cold War, bottled and shipped to the Libyan coast, just south of the Gulf of Sidra. For the Soviet advisory team stationed here, this was the edge of the world. A concrete and sand outpost tasked with guarding Colonel Gaddafi's line of death. Outside, the Mediterranean night was cool and absolute, a black velvet curtain against which their allied Libyan crews watched for ghosts. Inside the van, it was a world of sickly green light. Captain Dmitry Volkov, a 3-year veteran of the Soviet Air Defense Forces, or PVO, stared at his circular scope. His face was slick with sweat, illuminated by the rhythmic sweep of the indicator line. His job was simple: find the Americans. For days, the American Sixth Fleet had been maneuvering beyond the horizon. Carrier groups, battleships. The electronic chatter was deafening. The Libyans were agitated, paranoid, their bravado cracking. Dmitry, however, was a professional. He was here to mentor, to operate the complex S-200 Angara air defense system, what NATO called the SA-5 Gammon. It was a monster. A long-range, high-altitude beast designed to swat down American B-52 bombers and SR-71 Blackbird spy planes from hundreds of kilometers away. Its missiles were the size of telephone poles. Its square-pair engagement radar was a massive, powerful dish, the size of a small building, sitting exposed on the sand 100 meters away. "Anything?" his warrant officer, Pavel, mumbled, wiping his palms on his fatigues. "Nothing but sea clutter and their carrier noise," Dmitry replied, his voice a low monotone. He distrusted this mission. The S-200 system was strategic. It was built to defend the Rodina, the motherland, not to play chicken with American carrier jets in a desert backwater. It was slow to set up, slow to tear down, and its radar was a bonfire in the electromagnetic spectrum. When it was on, everyone knew it. Then, it happened. A Libyan lieutenant burst into the adjoining command post, shouting in frantic Arabic. The translator's voice cut through the static. "Contact! Multiple contacts! They are crossing the line!" Dmitry's training took over. S-200, engage! Power up the square pair! Full illumination! The order was relayed. A deep, mechanical groan vibrated through the bunker floor as the giant radar dish swiveled. A powerful hum spiked, the sound of megawatts of energy being focused into a tight beam, punching out across the water. On Dmitry's scope, the clutter instantly resolved. 3 distinct fast-moving targets. American. They were a 7 Corsair II aircraft, small attack jets. They were bait. "They are too low, Captain," Pavel said, his voice rising. "The S-200 cannot engage them this close." "It doesn't matter," Dmitry snapped. "We have acquisition. We are painting them. They know we see them. They will break off." This was the dance. The Americans would probe, the Libyans would light them up, and the Americans would retreat, having gathered the electronic intelligence they wanted. But this time, the dance was different. The targets did not break off. Instead, a new tone screamed in Dmitry's headset. It was a sound he had only ever heard in simulations, a high-pitched, terrifying warble, the sound of an enemy weapon locking onto him. "What is that?" yelled Pavel. "Anti-radiation," Dmitry shouted. "They fired! Shut it down! Shut down the radar now!" The Libyan crew panicked, slammed their controls. The deep hum of the square pair radar died instantly. The bunker was plunged into a sudden, terrifying silence, broken only by the fading echo of the warning tone. In the dark, Dmitry counted the seconds. 1, 2. The American missile, a Shrike, he assumed, would follow the beam. With the beam gone, the missile would go stupid. It would fly dumb, crashing harmlessly into the desert. This was the doctrine. This was the training. 3, 4. He was about to breathe. He was about to curse the Americans for their audacity. 5. The world vanished in a flash of white light, and a sound so loud it was felt, not heard. The reinforced concrete wall of the command bunker buckled, throwing Dmitry from his chair. The air was sucked from his lungs, replaced by dust, smoke, and the smell of vaporized metal. Pavel was screaming, or had been. The green glow of the consoles was gone, replaced by the flickering orange of fire. Dmitry, his ears ringing, staggered to the blast door. He threw it open and stared into hell. The square pair radar, The multi-ton, technologically priceless heart of their S-200 battery was gone. In its place was a smoking, twisted crater of wreckage. The explosion had been direct, precise, impossible. "They shut it down," he whispered, his mind failing to process the sight. "We shut it down. The missile. It shouldn't have known where to go." He was wrong. This was not a Shrike. This was not a weapon he understood. This was something new, something that didn't follow the rules. Within an hour, reports flooded the Soviet command channels. 2 other Libyan SAM sites, an S-75 Divina and a 2K-12 Cub, had suffered the same fate. Their crews had detected the incoming American strike package, illuminated them with their fan-song and straight-flush radars, detected the incoming anti-radiation missiles, and shut down. And they had been hit anyway. The Phantom had struck 3 times, decapitating the Libyan air defense network in under 10 minutes. The American jets, their path cleared, proceeded to their targets. Back in Moscow, in the secure chambers of the Ministry of Defense, the after-action reports were read with a mixture of disbelief and cold, creeping dread. The field commanders were reporting a glitch, a catastrophic failure of doctrine. But the GRU, military intelligence, knew better. This was no glitch. This was an American capability they had not known existed. A missile that could hunt radar, lose its target, and keep going. A missile that could remember. This single night of combat, thousands of miles from the motherland, had just rendered the entire Soviet Union's multi-trillion ruble air defense network, the PVO, obsolete. This new, terrifying phantom threatened the very foundation of Soviet military strategy, and the hunt to identify it, to understand it, had just become the highest priority in the Kremlin. If you're intrigued by the hidden histories and technological mysteries of the Cold War, subscribe to Cold War Impact. We uncover the declassified stories that shape the world we live in. The mystery was simple, and its implications were world-ending. How do you fight an enemy who can punish you for simply looking? How do you stop a bullet that knows where you were? The Soviet investigation began not with a bang, but with a quiet, panicked file being opened in a nondescript office in Moscow. The title on the file was simple: Project Sidra Alpha. The Soviets were masters of air defense. It was a national obsession born from the trauma of the Second World War. They had built the densest, most layered, and most sophisticated integrated air defense system, or IADS, on Earth. It was a layered mesh of interceptor aircraft, long-range radars, medium-range SAMs, and short-range point defense systems. The doctrine was built on one unshakable foundation: radar. From the massive Tall King early warning systems in Siberia to the tiny gun dish radars on their ZSU-234 Shilka anti-aircraft tanks, everything was networked. Everything was built to see. And now, the Americans had found a way to turn that strength into a catastrophic weakness. The initial theories were frantic and grasping. The GRU's first directorate, responsible for electronic intelligence, suggested a new form of high-powered jamming. Perhaps the Americans had used a powerful electronic warfare aircraft, an EF-111 Raven, to burn through the radar's circuitry, causing it to overload and explode. This was dismissed. The physical evidence, what little was left, was clear. This was a kinetic kill, a missile, a warhead. Another theory proposed a new type of cluster munition. Perhaps the American A-7 aircraft had simply area-bombed the radar sites, getting lucky with a conventional bomb. This too was rejected. The precision was too great. 3 sites, 3 direct hits, all on the primary engagement radars, all within minutes of each other. This was not luck. This was assassination. The most plausible and most terrifying theory came from the PVO's own technical analysts. They believed it was an advanced version of the AGM-45 Shrike. The Shrike was the standard American anti-radiation missile, a weapon the Soviets knew well from Vietnam. It was simple. It was a passive radar homing missile. It listened for a radar transmission, locked onto the source, and followed that beam of energy all the way to the dish. The Soviet counter was equally simple and drilled into every SAM operator in the Warsaw Pact and its client states: miganie, or blinking. The moment your warning receiver chirped, you shut the radar off. The beam vanished. The Shrike, now deaf, would lose its lock and fly ballistic, missing by a wide margin. It was a cat-and-mouse game, and the Soviets were very good at it. But this was different. The reports from Libya were explicit. Captain Volkov, who was recalled to Moscow for debriefing, was adamant. "We shut down," he repeated, his voice strained, to a panel of grim-faced generals. "Total electronic silence. 5 seconds passed. Then the impact. It did not lose us. It found us in the dark." This meant the new weapon had, to the Soviet mind, an almost supernatural capability. It implied 2 possibilities, both of which were devastating. Possibility 1. The missile was impossibly fast, so fast that it could cover the distance from the launching aircraft to the radar site in less than the 5-second shutdown window. This would imply a hypersonic weapon, something the Soviets themselves were only dreaming of. It would mean their operators were humanly incapable of reacting in time. Possibility 2. The missile was intelligent. It had a memory. It received the radar's coordinates in that first brief second of illumination, and when the radar beam vanished, it didn't matter. The missile remembered the location. It navigated on its own, using an internal guidance system, to the last known position. The generals in that room prayed for the first possibility. Speed was a problem of physics. It could be countered. A new, faster-reacting radar switch, perhaps. A new automated defense system. But the second possibility, a smart missile, that was a problem of philosophy. It meant the entire doctrine of blinking was a lie. It meant the act of blinking was, itself, the signal that confirmed the target. It meant that the only way to survive was to never turn your radar on at all. And an air defense system that cannot turn on its radar is just a collection of very expensive, very stationary targets. It is, in effect, completely useless. The Americans had, it seemed, invented a key that unlocked the entire Soviet defense network. The investigation, Project Sidra Alpha, was no longer just an after-action review. It was a race for survival. The investigation began with tweezers and dustpans. In the smoking craters that had once been Libya's most advanced SAM sites, Soviet GRU technical teams, working under the flimsy protection of Libyan guards, sifted the debris. This was the grim archaeology of the electronic war. They were searching for fragments, for any piece of the Prizrak, the ghost, that had haunted them on March 24th. The work was frustrating. A high-speed kinetic kill weapon does not leave a tidy corpse. It vaporizes. It shatters into 1,000 insignificant pieces. What they found was confusing. They bagged fragments of metal casing, scorched wiring harnesses, and pieces of circuit boards. These were flown by military transport to the Chkalovsky Air Base near Moscow and rushed under armed guard to the specialized laboratories of the PVO's own research institutes. These institutes were the brains of the Soviet defense empire. Places like the Vimpel Design Bureau, which designed their own air-to-air missiles, and Phasotron, which built their most advanced radars. The men who worked there were not soldiers, they were physicists and engineers, the high priests of Soviet electronics, and they were now tasked with performing an autopsy on a weapon based on scraps of shrapnel. Their initial reports, filed under the top-secret Project Sidra Alpha file, were bleak. The warhead appears to be a standard American pattern blast fragmentation type, approximately 150 pounds, one report read. Propulsion is a solid-fuel rocket motor, high-thrust, smokeless, all consistent with known air-to-ground ordnance. Then came the caveat, the sentence that chilled the generals. Of the guidance section, no significant components have been recovered. The seeker head and primary logic boards were either pulverized or, more likely, subject to a self-destruction charge. This was a dead end. The Americans weren't just smart, they were careful. They had designed their Phantom to keep its secrets, even in death. The physical evidence was a cold trail. All the Soviets knew for sure was that the weapon was American, it was a missile, and it was lethally precise. The how remained a mystery, locked inside a missing piece of silicon. With the labs unable to provide an answer, the burden shifted to the first chief directorate of the KGB. This was Line X, the division responsible for stealing foreign science and technology. Agents in Washington, London, and Paris were activated. Their priorities shifted. They were no longer just hunting for blueprints of the B-1 bomber or the new M1 Abrams tank. They were now hunting for a Phantom. They were ordered to acquire anything related to American anti-radiation or defense suppression programs. This too proved to be a black hole. The defense contractors, companies like Texas Instruments, were walled fortresses of security. The program, whatever it was buried deep in the American black budget. The KGB's agents came up empty. While the spies hunted, and the engineers theorized a different kind of investigation was happening on the front lines. It was an investigation of fear. The Prizrak became a legend, a bogeyman that haunted every Soviet radar operator from the plains of East Germany to the mountains of Afghanistan. The doctrine of Miganie, the life-saving blink, was now a terrifying gamble. Picture a PVO captain in charge of an S-75 Dvina battery, the workhorse of the Soviet air defenses, stationed in the Fulda Gap. It is a tense night in 1987. A flight of American F-4G Wild Weasel aircraft, the dedicated radar hunters of the US Air Force, approaches the border. They are ferreting, sniffing for electronic signals. The captain's spoon rest acquisition radar picks them up. His duty is clear. Transfer the target to the Fan-Song engagement radar. Light them up. Show them they are being targeted. Force them to break off. He gives the order. Fan-Song active. The high-pitched hum of the radar fills the van. On the American side, a warning light flashes in the F-4G cockpit. The pilot reacts. In the Soviet van, the world explodes in noise. The warning receiver shrieks. The unmistakable, terrifying warble of an incoming Prizrak. "Blink!" the captain screams. "Shut it down!" The Fan-Song goes silent. The operators freeze. The captain's heart hammers against his ribs. He counts 1, 2, 3. He is acutely aware of the multi-million ruble radar dish sitting just outside, the centerpiece of his entire battery, now deaf and blind. 4, 5. This was the window. The moment of impact in Libya. 6, 7. Nothing. Only the quiet hiss of the ventilation. After a full, agonizing minute, he gives the order to reactivate the acquisition radar. The F-4G aircraft are gone. They have turned back. He is safe. But the victory feels like a defeat. He is drenched in sweat. He will never know the truth of that moment. Was it a dumb Shrike missile, which his blink had successfully decoyed? Or was it the Prizrak, the smart missile, which the American pilot had chosen not to fire, content to have mapped his position? Or had he simply been lucky? This uncertainty was the true weapon. It was psychological warfare waged with electronics. The PVO, the most powerful air defense network ever built, was being paralyzed by a ghost. Soviet operators became hesitant. They would wait, seeking visual confirmation from spotters, trying to use optical trackers, anything to avoid being the first to turn on their powerful, all-seeing radar. But a SAM that cannot see is not a weapon, it is a target. This hesitation, this new, deep-seated fear, was the Prizrak's greatest victory. It opened up corridors of safety for American strike packages. The hunters had become the hunted. Back in Moscow, with no physical evidence and no human intelligence, the analysts at the GRU and the research institutes were forced to do the one thing a military planner hates. They were forced to guess. They had to invent their own phantom. Their first and most prominent theory was stealth. The Americans, they posited, had developed a low-observable aircraft, what would eventually be known as the F-117. This aircraft, invisible to their radars, was somehow getting behind their lines or directly overhead and dropping a new type of precision-guided bomb onto the radar sites. The anti-radiation signal they were detecting was a decoy, a form of electronic warfare to mask the real attack. This theory gained traction because it fit their worldview. The Soviets were already deeply paranoid about American stealth research. It explained the lack of warning. It explained the precision. As a result, vast sums of money were diverted. They began a crash program to develop new low-frequency radars, like the Nebo and Castor systems, which they believed could counter the stealth threat. They were, in effect, building a shield against the wrong sword. The second theory was even more complex. The master-slave weapon. The Americans, they theorized, were firing two weapons at once. A master missile, a standard Shrike, would home in on the radar. When the operator blinked, the Shrike would lose its lock. But in that final second, it would transmit the target's exact coordinates to a second, slave weapon. This second weapon, perhaps a small, air-launched cruise missile, would then fly to that pre-programmed coordinate, using its own internal navigation, striking the radar site even after it had gone silent. This theory terrified them because it implied a level of high-speed digital data linking and automated coordination that their own industry could not hope to match. The third theory was the simplest, and the one they were most reluctant to accept. They called it the inertial missile. This weapon was a single missile, like a Shrike, but with a crucial addition: a highly accurate, miniaturized inertial navigation system, or INS. In this scenario, the missile's brain did two things. It listened for the radar beam, as a Shrike did. But as it flew, its internal INS was constantly calculating its own position in space. The moment it acquired the radar signal, it didn't just lock on, it created a target file. It calculated the radar's exact coordinates on the Earth. When the Soviet operator blinked, the missile's radar seeker went blind. But it didn't matter. The missile's logic simply switched modes. It told its INS, "The signal is gone. I don't care. Fly to these exact coordinates." The PVO generals dismissed this. An INS small enough to fit in a missile and accurate enough to hit a truck from 30 miles away after being launched from a maneuvering fighter jet? It was science fiction. Their own inertial systems were bulky, heavy, and prone to drift. They could get you into the right city, but not the right building. They projected their own limitations onto their enemy. They could not imagine the Americans had solved the problem of miniaturized, high-speed, solid-state digital processing. The final report of Project Sidra Alpha was a masterpiece of bureaucratic ambiguity. It concluded that the threat was a complex, new-generation weapon system and that all aspect countermeasures were required. In plain language, it meant, we have no idea what this is, and we have no idea how to stop it. The ghost was still free, and the entire Soviet military machine was now chasing shadows, looking for stealth bombers and imaginary cruise missiles, all while the real killer was hiding in plain sight. While the generals in Moscow dismissed the inertial missile theory as pure science fiction, and while their spies hunted for blueprints of imaginary stealth aircraft, the answer was not hidden in a top-secret hangar. It was being assembled by the thousand in a clean, brightly lit factory in Dallas, Texas. The world of the Soviet PVO was one of concrete bunkers, vast radar dishes, and the smell of ozone and hot metal. It was a world of analog power, of brute force. The world that created the Prizrak was a world of air-conditioned laboratories, silicon wafers, and engineers wearing white lab coats, hunched over computer terminals. The phantom that had paralyzed the Soviet military was born not from a breakthrough in rocketry, but from a breakthrough in computation. The shift in perspective begins not in the 1980s, but 2 decades earlier, in the skies over North Vietnam. The American air campaigns, Operation Rolling Thunder, and later Linebacker, had been a brutal education. American pilots, trained to fight high-altitude nuclear battles, were suddenly confronted by the S-75 Divina, the SA-2 guideline. This was the same system that had swatted Gary Power's U-2 from the sky. And now, the Vietnamese, guided by Soviet advisors, were using it with lethal effectiveness. The American response was the Wild Weasel. These were the bravest men in the sky, flying F-100 and later F-4 Phantom aircraft. Their job was to fly ahead of the main strike package, intentionally trolling for SAM sites. They would let the fan-song radars lock onto them, and as the missile warning screamed in their headsets, they would fire their own weapon, the AGM-45 Shrike. But the Shrike, as the Soviets knew, was a simpleton. It was a bloodhound that could only follow a fresh scent. The moment the Vietnamese operator, using Soviet blink tactics, shut down his radar, the Shrike went dumb. It would arc uselessly into a rice paddy. For the Wild Weasel pilot, this was a terrifying proposition. He had just annoyed a SAM battery, which was now tracking him optically, and his one weapon against it had failed. The AGM-78 Standard Arm was an improvement. It was larger, faster, and had a rudimentary memory circuit. It could remember the general direction of the radar, but it was big, expensive, and its analog memory was crude. It could hit the field, but it couldn't hit the van. By the early 1970s, the US Navy and Air Force knew this cat-and-mouse game was unsustainable. They didn't need a better Shrike. They needed a revolution. They needed a missile that would guarantee a kill, even if the operator blinked. They needed a missile that was smarter than the man operating the radar. In 1974, the contract was awarded. The program was designated HARM, High-Speed Anti-Radiation Missile. The winning contractor was not a traditional builder of airframes, but a company that had helped invent the microchip, Texas Instruments. This was the crucial choice. The challenge, as defined by the Pentagon, was not one of aerodynamics. It was one of data processing. The result was the AGM-88 HARM. To the Soviets in Libya, it was a ghost. To the engineers in Dallas, it was the solution to a complex equation. It solved the blink problem with 3 revolutionary pieces of ingenuity. 3 breakthroughs that the Soviet analysts, trapped in their analog mindset, could not conceive of. First, there was the broadband seeker. The old Shrike missile was a nightmare of logistics. It came in multiple versions, each with a seeker head tuned to a specific radar frequency. A Shrike built to kill an S-75 fan song was deaf to an S-125 low blow. A pilot had to know what he was hunting before he even took off. The HARM seeker was a revolution. It was a wideband digital receiver. It could listen to the entire spectrum of known enemy air defense radars, all at once. It was not just a seeker, it was a scanner. It could detect, identify, and prioritize multiple threats simultaneously. It was a digital threat library in the nose of a missile. It could tell the pilot, there are 3 radars out there. 2 are spoon rest search radars, but 1 is a fan song engagement radar. That is the one that can kill you. Second, there was the high-speed component. The HARM was incredibly fast, capable of speeds well over Mach 2. This was not just for show, this was a psychological weapon. It compressed the timeline. It meant that from the moment a Soviet operator's warning receiver went off to the moment of impact, the time was not 10 or 15 seconds. It was less than 5. It was designed to be faster than a human's ability to react, assess, and shut down. But the third component was the impossible one. It was the one the Soviet generals had dismissed as science fiction. The HARM had a brain. Tucked behind the seeker was a solid-state digital flight computer, coupled with a highly accurate, miniaturized, strapped-down inertial navigation system, or INS. This was the assassin's memory that Captain Volkov had faced in Libya. Here is how it worked, and why it was so devastating. When the American A-7 pilot over the Gulf of Sidra detected the square pair radar, he didn't just lock on, he selected the target and squeezed the trigger. The HARM dropped from the wing. In that first second, its broadband seeker stared at the powerful beam from the S-200's radar. It instantly calculated a target file. It identified the radar type, its exact frequency, and most importantly, its precise latitude and longitude. It stored these coordinates in its digital memory. Then, it ignited its smokeless rocket motor and accelerated, climbing toward the target. 5 seconds later, Captain Volkov, terrified, gave the order to shut it down. The massive square pair beam vanished. The electronic scent was gone. On an old Shrike missile, the mission would have been over. It would have gone stupid. But the HARM's brain simply executed a new line of code. Its logic switched. Mode 1, homing, failed. Mode 2, inertial, engaged. The missile's digital computer asked its INS a simple question. Where am I? The INS replied with its own precise coordinates. The computer then did the math. I am here, the target is there. The target is no longer talking, but I know its address. The missile's flight fins adjusted. It was no longer a radar homing missile. It was now a GPS-guided bomb, before GPS existed. It flew, ballistic but precise, on pure memory. When it arrived at the last known address, it executed its final, lethal logic. Its seeker would reacquire if the radar foolishly turned back on. If it did not, the missile simply flew to the pre-programmed coordinate and detonated its 145-pound warhead directly over the target. This was the Phantom. The inertial missile theory was not just real, it was fielded, operational, and had just drawn first blood. The true American dominance, the secret that the KGB's Line X could not steal, was not the missile itself. It was the industrial base that could mass-produce the miniaturized digital processors that made it possible. The Soviets were still building their computers with vacuum tubes and bulky transistors. Their inertial systems were massive, spinning gyroscopes, fit for a submarine but not for a missile. They simply could not imagine that their enemy was already fitting the power of a room-sized computer into the nose cone of a 10-inch wide pipe. The Soviets were looking for a ghost. They should have been looking for a microchip. The revelation did not come from a single, dramatic confrontation over the skies of Germany. There was no Top Gun moment where a MiG-29 pilot came face-to-face with the new American weapon. The truth, as it so often does in the world of intelligence, arrived quietly, not as a thunderclap, but as a whisper. It came in the form of a file, thin and innocuous, placed on the desk of a GRU colonel in Moscow in late 1987. The file contained a tear sheet, a single-page summary smuggled out of a NATO defense symposium in Brussels by a Line X agent. It was not a blueprint. It was not a classified technical schematic. In many ways, it was worse. It was a marketing abstract from Texas Instruments, complete with the weapon's official mundane designation, AGM-88 HARM, high-speed anti-radiation missile. The colonel convened the veterans of Project Sidra Alpha, the engineers and analysts who had spent 2 years chasing the Prizrak. They met in a secure, windowless room, the air stale with cigarette smoke. He projected a grainy, photocopied image onto the screen. It was the missile. It looked to their eyes unremarkable. Just another tube with fins. Then he projected the text. The analysts leaned forward, their blood running cold. The words, in bland technical English, confirmed their single greatest fear. They read the phrases, and each one was a nail in the coffin of their entire defense doctrine. Broadband, frequency agile seeker, solid-state digital processor, pre-briefed target of opportunity mode, and then the sentence that stopped the room. The sentence that ended the debate. Primary guidance supplemented by strapped-down inertial navigation system for terminal homing on shutdown emitters. The room was utterly silent. The inertial missile, the science fiction theory that the senior generals had dismissed as impossible as a projection of their own technological fantasies, was real. It was not just real, it was in production. The Americans were building them by the thousand. This was the shock moment. It was not the shock of an explosion, but the cold, sickening shock of realization. The slow, creeping horror of understanding that you are not just behind, but that you are playing an entirely different game, and you have just discovered you don't even know the rules. One of the senior engineers, a man who had designed the radar for the S-300, a man whose entire life's work was built on the power of the radar beam, spoke into the silence. His voice was hollow. "They did it," he whispered. "They put a brain inside a bullet." Every countermeasure they had proposed, every theory they had chased for the past 24 months, was instantly rendered obsolete. It wasn't stealth. It wasn't a master-slave weapon. It was, in their minds, something infinitely more terrifying. A disposable, fire-and-forget, artificially intelligent assassin. The implications cascaded through the room, through the Ministry of Defense, and into the Kremlin itself. It meant that every blink tactic, every piece of training drilled into 100,000 PVO operators was a death sentence. It was a dinner bell. It actively confirmed the target for the missile's inertial memory. It meant that their new, expensive stealth hunting radars, the low-frequency NEBO systems, were just as vulnerable. The moment they switched on, they too would become targets for a weapon that didn't care about the radar's purpose, only its location. It meant that the entire multi-trillion ruble PVO network, the thousands of radar dishes, the concrete bunkers, the hardened command posts stretching from East Germany to the Pacific, was not a shield. It was a target list. A pre-built inventory of coordinates for a missile that could not be fooled. The response was not one of resignation. It was one of frantic, desperate, and ultimately futile countermeasures. The Soviet military machine, wounded and cornered, did what it did best. It threw everything it had at the problem. Their first response was a new doctrine: shoot and scoot. If the missile knew where you were, the only answer was to not be there when it arrived. The age of the static, fortress-like SAM site, the S-75 and S-200, was over. The harm had killed it. A crash program was initiated to fast-track a new generation of mobile air defense. This gave birth to the 9K-37 Buck, what NATO called the SA-11 Gadfly, and the formidable Tor SA-15 Gauntlet. These were not just transportable, they were true, all-in-one, transporter, erector launcher and radar, or TELARs. They were designed to drive into a field, unmask, turn on their radar, fire their missiles, and be moving to a new, pre-planned hiding spot in under 5 minutes. Their second response was electronic. If you can't hide, then you must blind. The Soviet electronic warfare divisions, the REB forces, were given a blank check. They rushed to develop and field a new generation of powerful, ground-based jammers. These were systems like the SPS-5000, and the Polina series. Their job was not to be subtle. Their job was to blast out so much white noise and garbage signals across the entire radio spectrum that the harm's delicate broadband seeker would be overwhelmed, deafened by a hurricane of static. Their third response was the most cunning: deception. The Soviets, masters of maskirovka, or military deception, began to mass-produce cheap, expendable decoys. These were, in essence, electronic scarecrows. A small trailer, parked 500 meters away from the real Fan-Song radar van, would be equipped with a simple emitter that was programmed to broadcast a perfect imitation of the Fan-Song signal. The tactic was simple. The moment a harm was detected, the real radar would shut down, and the decoy would light up. The harm's logic, they prayed, would be tricked into following the stronger, clearer signal, vaporizing a cheap trailer and leaving the priceless radar complex untouched. On paper, these responses were brilliant. They were the logical answer to the problem. In practice, they were all catastrophic failures. The shoot and scoot doctrine failed because the Americans had anticipated it. The Wild Weasel crews, now flying F-4G aircraft and later F-16 seconds, equipped with the Harm Targeting System, or HTS, were not just firing at signals. They were timing them. The Harm was so fast, covering tens of miles in just a few minutes, that by the time the Soviet crew had confirmed a launch, received the order to scoot, and begun shutting down their systems, the missile was already in its terminal phase. The Buk and Tor systems were mobile, but they were not fast enough. The jamming doctrine failed because the Harm was smarter than they thought. The engineers at Texas Instruments had already given its digital brain a home-on-jam mode. When the missile was flooded with a powerful, obvious jamming signal, its logic did not shut down, it simply reprioritized. It concluded, "I cannot hear the radar, but I can hear that incredibly powerful jammer. The jammer is right next to the radar, therefore, I will kill the jammer." The Soviet jammers, designed to protect the radars, simply became the Harm's new favorite target. And finally, the decoy doctrine failed because the Harm was a system, not just a missile. The American pilot in the cockpit had a new display. He could see the Harm's seeker. He could see two Fan-Song signals light up. One was stationary, the other had just moved, the shoot and scoot vehicle. Or one signal was strong and a new one just popped up, the decoy. The pilot, a trained human, could use his own logic to decide. That one is the real target. He could tell the missile, "No, not that one. This one." The Harm was not a fire-and-forget weapon. It was a collaborative weapon. It was the perfect synthesis of a brilliant pilot and a brilliant machine. The Soviets were trapped. Every counter they designed, the Americans had already anticipated and built a counter for. The Harm had rendered their entire air defense philosophy, their most expensive military investment, completely and totally useless. They were building shields of wood against a sword of fire. The final, brutal, public demonstration of this fact was just a few years away, when the world would watch, live on television, as this impossible missile methodically and ruthlessly dismembered a Soviet-built air defense network, piece by piece, in the skies over Iraq. The end did not come with a whimper. It came with a televised, 43-day-long public execution. If the 1986 strike on Libya was the Harm's secret debut, a quiet assassination in the dark, then Operation Desert Storm in 1991 was its public unveiling on the world stage. It was the final verdict, delivered live and in prime time, on the entire Soviet air defense philosophy. On the eve of the Gulf War, Iraq possessed the fourth largest military on Earth. Its Integrated Air Defense System, or IADS, was the crown jewel of Soviet export. It was a dense, hardened, and sophisticated network, built, trained, and supplied by the Soviet Union. It had thousands of missiles, the same S-75, S-125, and S-200 systems that guarded Moscow, as well as thousands of modern mobile systems like the Kub, Osa, and the brand new Roland. It was all networked into French-built command centers, a hybrid of Eastern and Western tech that, on paper, was one of the most formidable defenses ever constructed. And in the first 48 hours of the war, the AGM-88 Harm and the Wild Weasel crews tore it to pieces. The air war began on January 17, 1991. The first wave was not Harms, but Tomahawk cruise missiles and F-117 stealth fighters, the other impossible American technology the Soviets had feared. They punched precise, surgical holes in the eyes of the network, the central command and control bunkers in Baghdad. Then came the weasels. F-4G Phantoms and carrier-launched F, divided by A-18 Hornet aircraft, their pods loaded with HARM missiles, surged into Iraqi airspace. This time, they were not just probing, they were hunting. What happened next was not a battle, it was a route. The Iraqi radar operators, many of them trained by the same Soviet advisors who had analyzed the Libyan strikes, faced the Prizrak's impossible choice. If they turned their radars off, they were blind. They were useless, cowering in their bunkers as coalition strike packages, invisible and untouchable, flew overhead to their targets. If they turned their radars on, even for a second, a HARM would see them. The terror of the Prizrak was so absolute that most Iraqi SAM crews, even under threat of execution by their own command, chose to shut down. They refused to paint a target. They knew that to light up a coalition aircraft was to sign their own death warrant. The HARM missile, simply by existing on the battlefield, had achieved a soft kill on the entire network before a single shot was fired. But many were forced to engage, and when they did, the HARM was waiting. Over the course of the war, coalition aircraft would launch more than 2,000 HARM missiles. The assassin's memory that had baffled Captain Volkov 5 years earlier was now a mass-produced, ruthlessly efficient tool. The HARM's digital brain, combined with the new HARM targeting system, HTS, pod on the F-16, allowed pilots to see, categorize and prioritize every Iraqi radar on the battlefield. They didn't just fire at the first signal, they chose their victims. Kill the square pair first, it has the longest range, then kill the straight flush. Save the gun dish for last. It was a massacre. The Iraqi IADs, that multi-billion-dollar fortress, simply disintegrated. The killer statistic, the final damning verdict on the Soviet doctrine, is not one of missiles to hits. It is this. Over the course of more than 100,000 coalition air sorties flown during Desert Storm, not one single aircraft was confirmed to be lost to a radar-guided surface-to-air missile. The Iraqi crews, in their final desperate moments, had resorted to firing their missiles in barrage. They would point their launchers at the sky and fire them unguided like artillery, praying for a 1-in-a-million lucky hit. This was the final, pathetic degradation of the world's most sophisticated air defense system. The smart weapon, the radar-guided SAM, had been rendered so terrifyingly obsolete that its operators were forced to use it as a dumb rocket. The HARM had turned the Soviet shield into an empty, hollow gesture. This military failure was a symptom of a much deeper, systemic, and fatal disease. The HARM missile was more than a weapon, it was an idea, and it was an idea the Soviet Union was incapable of producing. The Cold War was not in the end a contest of tanks, or bombs, or ideology. It was a contest of innovation. The Soviet system was built on imitation. It was a centralized, top-down command economy. Its industrial strength was in heavy manufacturing, steel, concrete, and brute force rocketry. Its scientific advancements came from brilliant theorists, but its technological application was hobbled by a bureaucratic, paranoid system. The KGB's Line X was one of its most effective branches, tasked with stealing Western technology from the atomic bomb to the microchip to be reverse-engineered and copied. The Soviets could steal a microchip. They could painstakingly clone an IBM computer. But they could not, under any circumstances, replicate the ecosystem that invented the microchip. The AGM-88 HARM was a product of that ecosystem. It was born from a culture of decentralized, chaotic, and relentless innovation. It was the child of Texas Instruments and Silicon Valley. It was a weapon built not of steel, but of silicon. Its lethality was not in its warhead, but in its software. The Prizrak, the inertial missile that the Soviet generals had dismissed as science fiction, was a direct result of the American lead in miniaturized, high-speed digital processing. While the Soviets were still perfecting their vacuum tubes and grappling with the crude, early transistors of their bulky mainframe computers, the Americans were putting the processing power of a room-sized ENIAC onto a chip the size of a fingernail, and then putting that chip into the nose of a missile. This was a gap that espionage could not bridge. You cannot steal an entire industrial and economic philosophy. The HARM was the perfect symbol of this fatal chasm. The Soviets had built a shield based on the analog 20th century principles of raw power. The S-200's square-pair radar was a monument of the industrial age, a multi-ton beast that blasted megawatts of energy into the sky. And the harm was the vanguard of the digital age. A small, sleek, intelligent predator that used a few watts of processing power to turn that brute strength into a fatal liability. The impossible event that Captain Volkov witnessed in the Libyan desert was not a technological anomaly, it was a death knell. It was the sound of the digital future arriving to execute the analog past. The mystery of the Prizrak was, in the end, the mystery of the Soviet Union's own demise. They were a 20th century industrial giant, a colossus of steel and steam, rendered extinct by an enemy who had learned to weaponize pure thought. The Cold War was not won by the tank, it was won by the microchip, and the AGM-88 harm was the bullet that proved it.